As Spider-Man No Way Home swings into theaters, every teenager and nostalgic millennial is waiting for the chance to see the biggest movie of the year. But long before Spider-Man was smashing box office records, the Marvel superhero was helping to push Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Sure, nowadays Peter Parker is hanging out with Marvel's most psychedelic superhero, Doctor Strange. But in the early days of his life on the page, the web-slinger was more afraid of psychoactive substances than he was of giant reptiles and flying goblins. Let's swing into this little history lesson. My life as Spider-Man is probably as dangerous as any, but I'd rather face 100 supervillains than toss it away by getting hooked on hard drugs. Because that's one fight you can't win. So lamented our friendly neighborhood spider in issue 96 of the Amazing Spider-Man run in 1971. This legendary story arc sees Peter Parker's roommate and best friend Harry Osborn become addicted to drugs, while Spider-Man is busy fighting his arch-nemesis and Harry's father, the Green Goblin. Ultimately, Spider-Man ends up defeating the Green Goblin, but not with his super spider strength. Rather, Spider-Man shows the Goblin the dire state that his son had fallen to whilst he was out committing supervillain shenanigans. The shock of seeing Harry as an addict returns the Goblin to sanity, making him realize that he needs to be a better father. Presumably, after he gets out of jail for mass murder. The entire 3-issue storyline, which was actually created to be an anti-drug story, is packed full of great "this is your brain on drugs" level dialogue. For example, after saving a teen from jumping off a building while high on an LSD-like drug, Spider-Man bemoans, "I sure hope that poor guy will be alright, but I wouldn't bet on it. Any drug strong enough to give you that kind of trip can damage your brain, but bad." Who knew? Spider-Man's greatest enemy wasn't the Green Goblin or the Kingpin, but rather, drugs. The history of how this story came to be is actually interesting in its own right. See, in 1971, what was allowed to be published in comic books was governed by something called the Code of Comics Magazine Association of America, or the CCA. This code implicitly banned any mention of drugs, even if they were presented in a negative light. Despite this, the United States was gripped by drug hysteria, and the Nixon administration wanted to push anti-drug messages to children. As part of this push, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reached out to Stan Lee personally, asking him to put anti-drug messages into comics. Stan Lee, wanting to do his patriotic duty, obliged. Ironically, the CCA did not give their seal of approval to the comic, but Stan Lee and Marvel decided to publish it anyway. Later, Lee would say, "I felt that the United States government somehow took precedence over the CCA." In fact, the CCA seemed to agree, as they decided not to punish Marvel or Lee. Within a year, they had actually changed their rules to now say, "Narcotics and drug addiction shall not be presented, except as a vicious habit." After the rule change, other comic publishers such as DC began publishing anti-drug stories. For example, in an issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Green Arrow's teenage sidekick Speedy becomes addicted to heroin. Later, Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign endorsed a run of Teen Titans, where a team of teenagers battled against drug dealers. Like many of the individuals responsible for pushing anti-drug content, Stan Lee at the time didn't actually know too much about drugs. In a later interview, when discussing the teen who jumped off the building while high on drugs, Stan Lee said this, "I remember it contained one scene where a kid was going to jump off a roof and thought he could fly. My problem is that I know less about drugs than any living human being. I didn't know what kind of drug it was that could make you think you could fly. I don't even think I named anything. I just said that he had done something." Of course, telling children not to do drugs can be a responsible message. No parent in their right mind would want their comic book telling their kids to do drugs. However, there is a difference between giving a responsible message and demonizing all mind-altering substances. many of which have been shown to be effective treatment options for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other mental illnesses. Nevertheless, here at Spotlight, we're not going to go and demonize the late and great Stan Lee. His motivations were pure and he just wanted to help a generation of children. I hope you all enjoy No Way Home.